So another thing that's making this video series a slog is it is virtually impossible to have time to record things. So, and have there be lighting. I need to get one of those like orb things or something. Who knows? Okay. Back to where was I? I finished talking about my issues with C.S. Lewis. And it gave me some interesting answers, but also more questions. So this book inspired me to do further reading because it always gave me a thrill to find the compelling reasons that either supported my supernatural beliefs or made me think about them critically. I found a book called Catholicism and Reason in my house that was part of a bigger book series. It had logical diagrams and backed up its claims with references that I found very useful and important to know. Most of the diagrams detailed why it was logical to think Christ was God, since he was neither a liar nor insane. It also detailed the specific prophecies in the Old Testament that were fulfilled through Christ's birth and ministry that could not possibly be a coincidence. So, I think another psychological reason why this is bothering me is because I was so wrong for so long despite valuing logic and evidence. And, I went down such a huge rabbit hole of theological doctrine with the tools of the trade that should have kept me out of it, but I guess, I was only a few years into it, and, I had, a giant, 1,000-year-old institution, that I was up against in terms of, a belief system that survived generations. It's just discouraging, and I think about how long it would take to untangle false beliefs from so many people, and it was a very long, painful experience to untangle it for me as well, which is the whole reason why I'm sharing this story. So, but in order to set the groundwork, you have to see how much of a structure there was before it all collapses. So yeah, prophecies that came true, super cherry-picked, super confirmation bias, said he was a messenger from God, false binary, like the logical fallacies are just punching me in the face as I look at this. Okay, anyways, back to the story. To help me through the hard problems in my life, I often imagined what heaven would be like, embellishing my fantasies in vivid detail. The only hard problems I had at this time in my life were romantic ones. I imagined heaven as a place where everyone was in love with everyone and jealousy didn't exist. My idea of heaven also had things like a Need for Speed style racetrack with every car I could want, being able to fly and breathe in water, all the best food I could ever want, etc., etc. Very hedonistic. I was very motivated to get myself and the people I love to heaven, and this motivation impacted everything about my life. It was my top priority. And that was another reason why I was so invested in all these details and knowing the stakes either way, because the consequences were eternal, and the reward and the punishment were also infinite. So you take infinite duration and infinite intensity, and it just made real life just look like a waiting room. Like, you're not going to fuss about the chair in the waiting room for 5 minutes for your eternity of your existence. So, having a firm grounding and believing that was extremely important to have, a high degree of confidence in. All right. So, I even look forward to growing up and decorating my house with religious icons and images and having every sacramental I needed to fill my house with grace. I took a lot of pride and pleasure in religious images because they were beautiful, and I believed that what they stood for was even more beautiful and true. When I started taking medieval history, I learned about St. Thomas Aquinas. He wrote a series of books called the Summa Theologica, which was basically the definitive everything you ever wanted to know about Catholic apologetics set of books you could ever have. He was medieval, so obviously pre-science. But he was still, even though I don't agree with him, he was still a genius, and his collection of philosophical proofs for Catholicism had stood the test of time for hundreds of years. And did I mention he was the doctor of the church? He even included a list of every possible objection he could think of at the end of each proof, and he logically refuted them all. So, in other words, I like his style, and I like his method. Even if revisiting them now, I would come to different conclusions. At the time, they're breathtaking to read, and most of the explanations of God and the Trinity corresponded perfectly with my own pet theory idea that the Trinity was eternity, truth, and love. Learning this from Aquinas reinforced my beliefs in that idea of God very strongly. Now, my beliefs in God in the spiritual realm were aligned with Catholic teachings, but were not limited by Catholic teachings. It just so happened that the Catholic Church's theology matched up with my idea of God. I also knew that the teachings of the Catholic Church were only technically infallible when the Pope spoke ex cathedra, from the chair, on matters of faith of morals. So the scope of what was infallible was matters of faith and morals, and only when he spoke from the chair, officially. So that was it. So the reason why I trusted this infallibility was because in the Bible, Jesus told St. Peter, "And I say to thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give to thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whoever thou shalt bind upon earth, it shall be bound also in heaven. And whoever thou shalt loose upon earth, it shall be loosed also in heaven." This was supposedly how Jesus gave St. Peter the gift of papal infallibility. And the reason why I trusted the current pope's infallibility was because I was told that every pope was a direct successor of St. Peter. Therefore, every pope had the gift of infallibility passed on to them from the previous pope. There are very few Catholic teachings that were made with this type of infallible authority, so I had lots of wiggle room and freedom to think outside the box on spiritual matters. I trusted most of the Catholic teachings by their own merits, but every position I ever heard the Catholic Church endorse seemed thoroughly supported by logic and evidence. One thing I believed in that most Catholics didn't, so here we're going some deviation here, at 16 years old, was the possibility, not certainty, possibility that God was also infinitely evil as well as infinitely good. Contradiction? The only philosophical proof that rendered God only good was from Thomas Aquinas, who believed that existence itself was inherently good, and that evil was only accurately described as a privation of existence, like holes in Swiss cheese. The holes aren't a thing; they're minus Swiss cheese. But I disagreed. I could see that evil really existed in the world in a very tangible way. Had its own energy and substance. Intentionality. Since God consciously maintained all of created reality, it would therefore follow that he consciously maintained the existence of both good and evil. I brought this up to my teacher, and he told me that God was not infinitely good and evil. Rather, he was infinitely good and infinitely not good, or non-good, and that we only really know attributes of God via negativa, what he isn't. For example, he has no limits, he has no faults, etc. So, something to think about. Without adopting these deviant beliefs, I was still able to entertain them, like I held them as possibilities. And, I didn't commit to anything 100% in terms of these types of descriptions, but I was, pondering them. I incorporated the idea of God's evil side, secret evil side, into the sci-fi fantasy book I was writing at the time. I thought of eternity, God the Father, back to the Trinity again, like a number line. Even so, just because eternity and there's, a number line is infinite, eternity is infinite. So that's how I brought in the number line connection. Even though a number line could have an infinite amount of positive good numbers, it could and does also contain an infinite amount of negative numbers extending in the opposite direction. So you have infinite positive, that doesn't exclude infinite negative or contradict infinite negative. It's just going the other way. I figured that if the Holy Spirit was the love between eternity and truth, then the negative side of God, his left hand, would be the other side of infinity, where truth, i.e. logical reality, was not in harmony with eternity, reality itself. So, reality seemed to dictate logic, not vice versa. There's a lot to unpack there. So, logic is observed and derived from reality, and we use logic to understand reality. We don't derive reality from logic. There's a lot to not only unpack, but even discuss / disagree with. But for the time, I'm thinking reality is, God the Father, logic is God the Son. So you could conceive of reality without logic. And so, plus, since God was outside of time, everything about him was ever present, the good and the evil. And since he was outside space, he was neither a 3-dimensional being nor a 2-dimensional being. He was just being, all being itself. Like I said, I entertained and considered these ideas without ever really adopting them. So these kind of deviant thoughts were just bouncing around in my head, mixing with my sci-fi book. In my sci-fi fantasy book, I had the main villain argue with the protagonist about how God created humans not to love them, but only to use them and ultimately destroy them, like a shepherd uses his sheep before he leads them to the slaughter. Because in Catholicism, they always say Jesus is the good shepherd and we're the sheep as members of the church. Like, that's their analogy. Back to the sci-fi book, the villain was proud of the fact that God's most intelligent angel, Lucifer, was the first to reject him. He asked, "What do you know about God that Lucifer doesn't?" He also mocked God's idea that we should avoid being slaves to our desires. He also brought up points about how God always seemed to value human ignorance over knowledge, both in the Garden of Eden, with the tree of knowledge being forbidden, and when Jesus said, "Blessed are they who do not see but believe." In retrospect, I think I was subconsciously expressing my own doubts through this character I was writing in my book. My mind was able to associate these doubts exclusively with the fantasy character, allowing me to sidestep any need to deal with them as my own thoughts. I hear my kids again, so the video will have to be interrupted again.